Name is So we're going to go ahead and get started with today's training. I want to welcome everyone here today. My name is Jelani Killings. I'm an ethics analyst with the City of Oakland's Public Ethics Commission. And today's training will be a joint training. We have our friends and our partners with the Fair Political Practices Commission. We have Chloe Hackard as well as Stephen Hernandez, who are here with us today. And so today's training will be about 2 hours long, and we mean to stay within that time frame to respect everyone's time. And so just a little bit of a breakdown as far as how today's training will go. We know that we may have some folks who are not City of Oakland candidates, and that is okay because the FPPC portion will specifically cover state rules. And so the first hour and a half of today's training will focus specifically on state rules with the presentation from the FPPC. And then right after that, we will take questions if there are any questions that folks may have. And then we'll jump into a brief portion that will cover specifically Oakland rules and provisions as it pertains to the Oakland Campaign Reform Act here in the city of Oakland. And so just to share a little bit about some of the ground rules, we do want everybody to remain on mute during the presentation so that we can make sure that we hear the presenters loud and clear. If you do have any questions that come up during the presentation, we recommend and we ask that you go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, so you can feel free to type it into that question and answer box that you have on your screen. And so our staff will be monitoring the questions. And then once the presenters are done with their slides, we will have time to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And so once the FPPC covers the state rules, we'll pause and take some time to answer those questions specific to state rules. And then after that, we will begin the presentation on the Oakland specific rules, followed once again by another question and answer period. And so for all of those that are attending here today, we will make the slide deck and resources available via email after this presentation. And this is also being recorded live here today and will be made available on the Public Ethics Commission's website for your viewing as well if you want to go back and watch the presentation. So with that, once again, we want to welcome you. Thank you for taking the time today to complete this very important training. And then also as a last piece, we do want to highlight that for the treasurers that are here taking today's training, we will have a follow-up quiz that we are making available. And for folks that complete the quiz, we will be posting online on our website as well for viewing and to share broadly as far as completing today's training and understanding the requirements of both state and local rules as it pertains to campaign finance. So with that, we'll go ahead and get everything kicked off and started. And I'd like to introduce Chloe Hackard and Stephen Hernandez, who will kick off the first portion dealing with state rules. So welcome, Chloe, Stephen, and go ahead and take it away.
Alrighty, my name is Chloe Hackert, and I am the Education Program Manager of the Legal Division of the Fair Political Practices Commission. We're very big fans of long titles at the agency. And I would like to introduce our political reform consultant, Stephen Hernandez. He is an expert in this field, and he's going to kick us off with the first half of the training, and I will take over the second half.
All right, thank you, Chloe. Again, yeah, my name is Stephen Hernandez. I will do the first half of this training. The second half will cover about the Form 460 and then a few other components. Again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end of our presentation. But we'll go ahead and get started. So this is a webinar for candidates and treasurers. So the Fair Political Practices Commission was passed by California voters back in 1974, was when the Political Reform Act was created. So the Political Reform Act regulates conflicts of interest, campaign finance, and lobbying activities, and our agency's responsibility is really to enforce the act and to assist and inform candidates and public officials with complying with these particular laws. So in the first half here, we're going to learn about campaign forms, committee IDs, campaign bank accounts, and record keeping. So the first form we're going to go over is the Form 501. So before soliciting funds or making contributions, A candidate must file the Form 501. This is your candidate intention statement. This is filed with your local filing officer as a statement of the candidate's intention to run for office. So for every election, you're going to want to file, or you're going to need to file a Form 501, even if it's re-election for the same office. Here you can see an example of the Form 501. For local candidates, you'll just fill out section 1. You wouldn't need to fill out section 2, and then just make sure you sign and date your form there in section 3. This is the Form 470. This is the office holder and candidate campaign statement short form. So this form is used if a candidate does not intend to raise or spend $2,000 or more. If they don't plan on raising $2,000 or spending $2,000, then they will file this form, and they don't need to have a bank account established. Personal funds used to paying filing fees or ballot statement fees don't count towards the $2,000 threshold. If a candidate does file the Form 470, please note that when you accept any contributions, that you must have a bank account open. That's because you need somewhere to put those campaign funds in. Okay, so a Form 470 is used by office holders and candidates who don't have a controlled committee and do not anticipate receiving contributions totaling $2,000 or more in the calendar year, and don't anticipate spending $2,000 more or more in the calendar year. 470 filers who will not accept any donations may use their personal funds for campaign related expenses as long as they remain under the $2,000 mark. Here you can see an example of the Form 470. Again, you would just fill out the statement as it is. The instructions are very straightforward. Just go ahead and fill out the information. Make sure you sign and date your forms. This is a 470 supplement. So if you file a Form 470 and then exceed that $2,000 mark, you weren't expecting to, but you happen to do so, then you would file the 470 supplement. So the 470 supplement must be submitted within 48 hours of receiving contributions or making expenditures of $2,000 or more. When you are filling out the 470 supplement and you're submitting it, it has to be sent by guaranteed overnight delivery, personal delivery, fax or email. You can't use regular mail. And it has to be delivered not only to your local filing officer, but the opposing candidates and the Secretary of State's office. So make sure that if you do fill out the Form 470, you've gone over that threshold of $2,000, that you fill out the 470 supplement, and then you're submitting it to the appropriate people afterwards, okay, the appropriate entities. This is the Form 410. So the Form 410 is your statement of organization. So a candidate who intends to raise or spend $2,000 or more is going to file the Form 410. The Form 410 is submitted to the Secretary of State's office, and it must be an original wet signature copy. There is a $50 fee for submitting this form once you've qualified. You'll submit the original wet signature copy to the Secretary of State's office, but you'll submit a copy to your local filing office. Some things to note: if you're a candidate, please know that the name of the candidate committee must include your last name, the name of the last name of the candidate, the office, and the year of election. That's one of the more common dings that the Secretary of State will notice and then send it back to the candidates. So you'll want to make sure that, so your form doesn't get rejected, that you do include the last name of the candidate, the office sought, and then the year of election. The Form 410 must be filed within 10 days of raising or spending $2,000. And a candidate who intends to raise or spend $2,000 but is yet to meet that $2,000 threshold may still file the Form 410. You would just, and you can see here the example, check the box for initial and then check bubble the circle for not yet qualified. So sometimes you'll need to file the 410, say, to get your committee ID number, and you may not have hit that $2,000 threshold mark. That's okay. You can still file the Form 410, check the initial box, and then bubble for not yet qualified. Once you have qualified, you'll go ahead and do an amendment. There is also a little section here that says date qualification threshold met. you would update you would amend the Form 410, updating the information where that threshold, when the threshold was met. Okay. So again, you're just going to fill out the form as is, committee information, make sure you include the appropriate information. You have to have at least one treasurer. You can be your own treasurer. And then that the verification section is complete. If you are your own treasurer, you would need to sign both lines for candidate and for treasurer. If you have a separate treasurer, then you would sign as a candidate and then have the treasurer sign. This is the second page of the Form 410. Sometimes when you go out to go to bank account, they're going to ask you for a committee ID number. It's a little catch-22 because you can't get a committee ID number until you file the Form 410, and the Form 410 asks for bank account information. So if you're filing the Form 410, say to get your bank account information or to set up you're filing the Form 410 to get a committee ID number to set up your bank account. The form here, when it asks for a financial institution, just go ahead and put pending here. This acknowledges that you've seen this area, and that you're in the process of obtaining that information. You can't leave it blank. You need to put pending inside this area. Once you do receive that committee ID number after a successful process of the Form 410, and say you do go get that bank account information, you would just submit an amended Form 410 updating this financial institution section with your bank account information. But if you're filing the Form 410 to get the bank account, to get the committee ID number for your bank account information for your bank account, then you're going to put pending into this section here. Okay. As a candidate controlled committee, you're going to fill out type of committee. You're going to be a controlled committee. So you're just going to fill out this one section. People get confused that there is a third page. That's a continuation for the type of committee. You won't need to fill out that part. That's because you've already filled out your type of committee here on page 2 under type of committee, controlled committee. So you'll just fill out the line here. Okay. It can be a little confusing. If you do have questions, we can try to clarify at the end of our presentation, or you can always call us to go over the phone, go over the form with you over the phone to make sure that you're filling it out correctly. Or feel free to email us. So once you filed your Form 410 and it has been successfully submitted and processed, you would get assigned a committee ID number. You can look for your committee ID number through the Secretary of State's website by going to their Cal Access part of their website. We do have a link listed here. I believe you'll have a copy of the presentation, so you'll have that as a resource. You would just go to the Cal Access website, and then here in the search box, type in your committee name. I do suggest that you put something in vague. Sometimes if you're a little too specific, it'll trip up the system. So maybe just your last name or the position that you're running for. Okay. So now we're going to move on to bank account rules. So you're only allowed to have one bank account per committee. There's no commingling of funds, and all campaign expenditures must come from that campaign account. The only exception are filing and ballot statement fees. So note that the Political Reform Act does not require a specific type of bank account to be opened, just that a separate campaign bank account is created. So you can create a personal bank account for your campaign if you would like to. One suggestion or one word of thought that I give to say my callers is that if you are using a personal account, think of your donors. They may not want to write a check to your personal name. If it's not that big of an issue, say you're running a smaller campaign, or you don't perceive getting a lot of contributions, maybe it would be okay, but you may want to think about that if you choose to use say a personal account. But again, you can use any type of account you want, whatever's best for you and whatever's best for your campaign. It can be personal, business, a campaign account. That's totally up to you, and probably up to the bank that you're going through as well. All right, so we're gonna move on to Form 700. So all candidates must file a Form 700. This is filed with a local filing officer. And this is used to disclose any economic interests that may pose potential conflicts. Um, Filing officers will accept these before on the date of their local declaration of candidacy. If you're a successful candidate, just know that you'll file another Form 700 as your assuming office statement. There are various types of statements. As a candidate, you're going to check the box for candidate. Like I mentioned before, if you do get into office, you're going to do an assuming office. So you would do another one, but you would check the box for assuming office here. You would just fill out the appropriate information. If you have any disclosable interests, you would notate what you disclose in the various schedules here. If you had none, you would check the box for none. We do recommend putting a business address here, as it does ask for verification address, just because these are public documents. So you can put your home address. You can also use a business address, totally up to you. Just make sure you sign and date the form here as well. We also have information on the Form 700 on our website, FPPC website, if you have any questions, or you can, again, feel free to call us or email us. Okay, so we're going to go into some record keeping rules. And so candidates and committees should keep record of any and all campaign related expenses or documentation for 4 years after the election. Candidates and committees must keep a record of the name and address of their contributors of $25 or more. And then the name, address, occupation, and employer of contributors on contributions of $100 or more. So if there are any audits or enforcement cases, both the candidate and the treasurer are going to be responsible for liability for non-disclosure or lack of record. So you'll want to make sure as a candidate and as a treasurer that this information is correct and up to date. You can always get additional information on record keeping, and actually a lot of information for candidates running at the local level in the FPPC manual, campaign manual. Specifically, you can look up record keeping in Chapter 2, but campaign manual 2 is your resource for local candidates. Again, candidate treasurer equal liability. Okay. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to go look at campaign contributions. So what is a contribution? So a contribution can be anything from money, payments made by a third party, non-monetary items, loans, or even enforceable promises. All contributions made by the candidate or by their family members to their campaign must be disclosed. And all candidates and committees should remember to check with their local county or city clerk's office about any contribution limits. Okay. All contributions are going to be disclosed on the Form 460. And Form 460 is going to be the ins and outs of that campaign bank account. All contributions coming in and all expenditures going out. There are some exceptions to contributions. So voluntary personal services. So for an example, if an individual donates his or her personal professional service to a campaign, no contribution has been made or received as long as there is an understanding of no reimbursement. Communications from organizations to its members. An example of this would be payments made by an organization for certain communications that are sent only to the organization's members or employees or families. Those aren't contributions to a candidate that, as long as they're not contributions to a candidate that are endorsed in the communication. Uncompensated internet activity. An example of this, say, uncompensated internet activity by an individual, such as sending or forwarding electronic messages through social networking, blogging, or hosting or creating a website that supports or opposes a candidate or ballot measure is not considered a contribution or expenditure. Okay. If you have any direct questions around these exceptions to contributions, they can get a little more convoluted. Feel free to give us a call and we can kind of clarify if there's any questions about these specific types of exceptions to contributions. So home and office fundraisers, So fundraisers held by friend or family members, say at the home or at the office, those must be reported if the total cost of hosting the event is $500 or more. So all items are donated to the event, not just the occupant or the host that does the contributions. It's all items. So maybe you rented the space and that was $200 and the food was $100, right? That's $300 total. And you rented tables and chairs, it's another $100. Now we're at $400. But say then you had your guests coming in and somebody brought a $75 bottle of wine, and then another guest brought over another $75 bottle of wine. That's now pushed you over that $500 threshold. And that whole event now becomes reportable. So it's all contributions or all items donated to the event. Okay. So here, defining contributions, when are monetary contributions received? So it's the date received, that's the earlier of the following options. So the possession of the check, not the date it's deposited. So say you receive that check at that fundraiser, the date that you received the check, that's the date you received the contribution, not the day you went to put it in the bank account 2 days later. Possession of payment information of credit cards, and then when a contract vendor or collecting agent receive either of the above. You can use this as a resource. Again, you'll have a copy of the presentation. Whatever is the earliest of this list right here is the date that that particular contribution is received. So electronic contributions. So when receiving electronic contributions, such as credit card, wire transfers, or a lot of people are using now like PayPal or Venmo, these are allowed. Now the fees associated with these types of fundraising or that are deducted by the vendor before the contributions, those are reported as expenditures. So when you receive a contribution through one of these electronic systems, say you got $100 Venmo contribution, but there was a $5 fee for that, you're going to still notate that you received a $100 contribution. That $5 fee is going to be reported in the expenditures, the Schedule E of your Form 460. So you're not going to record your electronic contribution as $95. You're still going to record it as $100. That $5 fee is going to be reported somewhere else as an expenditure. Okay. So just be aware that if you're receiving those electronic contributions, to notate that full contribution. Okay, so some restrictions. So no contributions of $25 or more without the contributor's name or address. So again, if you have a contribution of $25 or more, you must obtain their name and address, and that must be reported or recorded. Contributions of less than $25 may be anonymous, though it's not advised. The reason for this is if somebody gave you a $20 contribution, right, that's not, it's allowed to be anonymous. But if that same person gave you a $20 contribution later, they're now at $40, and that contributor is you're gonna need to get that contributor's name and address. And so while it's not, while you don't have to record that name and address, it is advised that you do. But again, that's totally up to you as your campaign. No contributions of $100 or more in cash, money order, travel checks, or cashier's check. And then no contributions from foreign government or principals. You can receive contributions from a permanent green card holding residents. They may contribute. Again, and we'll probably say this again and again, local contributions may apply, so you'll always want to check with your local jurisdiction to see what their rules are. Lucky for us, we'll have somebody here talking about that here after us. So this is just a quick review over Government Code 84308. So if a candidate is an official who holds an appointed position and receives contributions for an elective office, he or she may be subject to the provisions of 84308. This provides officials from soliciting or accepting contributions of $250 or more from an entity doing business before the official's agency. So who's covered under 84308? Here's a list of those individuals. If you have a question or if you feel that you may fall under 84308, we do ask that you give us a call and then we can talk more in depth about that there. Or of course you can email. Major donor notifications. So just be aware, you must send a contributor of $5,000 or more a notice that they may need to file as a major donor. So major donors, again, if somebody gives you $5,000 or more, you'll need to notify them within 2 weeks of receiving that contribution totaling $5,000 or more. If a contribution of $10,000 or more is received in the 90 days prior to the date of election, that notice must be sent to the contributor within 1 week. Notices must be mailed, faxed, or emailed, or can be mailed, faxed, or emailed. And a major donor may need to file a Form 461 and or a Form 497. Okay, so a Form 461 may need to be filed if the individual or say that entity makes monetary or non-monetary contributions to the office holder, candidate, and committee totaling $10,000 or more in a calendar year. And a Form 497 would need to be filed within 90 days before the election. This includes also the date of election. If the committee receives contributions of $1,000 or more from a single source, that's when the Form 497 must be filed, and it must be filed within 24 hours. So just be aware if you're receiving contributions within that 90-day mark, that you would need to file a Form 497 if that contribution from a single source in the aggregate of $1,000 or more. Okay, so one thing that you still do not understand about contribution rules. So if there's anything you still don't understand about contribution rules, feel free to type it into the chat box and we'll cover it at the end. But again, if you have any specific questions, we can address them at the end, or you can feel free to give us a call. So I'm going to pass this over to Chloe, who's going to go over the Form 460 statement, and then a couple more topics, and then we'll go from there. All right, take it off, Chloe.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And as Stephen mentioned, we'll go over questions at the end. So now we're going to dive into the campaign statement Form 460. So this is filed by committees. So if you're a Form 470 filer and you're going to stay below that $2,000 threshold, this is not going to apply to you. This is applying to people that are candidates intending to fundraise and meet that $2,000 threshold. And this is the ins and outs to record it. So it's the long form record keeping for active qualified open committees. The Form 460, as I mentioned, it's money in and coming out. As mentioned at the bottom, both the candidate and the treasurer need to both sign the Form 460, verifying its completion and accuracy. All candidates and committees should review their filing schedule, which we'll go over towards the end, to make sure that they have the correct reporting period and dates, and make sure they're going to submit them on time for deadlines. Right now, we're in, if you're a candidate on the June ballot, we're in the 90-day election cycle, and your first pre-election is going to be due next month, right around the corner in April. So things are moving up quickly if you're a candidate on this June ballot. If you're on November, you got a little bit more time, but it is really important to make sure that you have the correct reporting period, you're getting the correct dates, and all those things. And we're going to go over those resources as we go along. So moving on to the next slide. We're going to go over a snapshot of schedules. So these are the money in schedules. Schedule A is contributions. Schedule B are loans received. Schedule C, non-monetary contributions, and Schedule I, miscellaneous increases to cash. So those are the main ones that you will be using as a candidate. The money out schedules you'll be using. B is loan repayments. It's one of the few that has a duality to it for money coming in and money coming out. Schedule E, apropos for expenditures. and Schedule F for accrued expenses. And we'll go over what that all means. There are additional schedules on the Form 460, Schedule D, Schedule G, and Schedule H. Those just aren't as commonly used by candidates. However, they are still available to you if you need to use them for the schedule. And again, we have a lot of resources that we'll go over, but we have a campaign manual, and feel free to call us if you're just not sure what you need to report on what schedule. So schedule by schedule, we're going to go on Schedule A, reporting monetary contributions. So this is what you'll use to report contributions received with the exception of loans. So as you can see here, if a contributor makes contributions that total $100 or more, they must be itemized on the schedule. For example, if someone gives you $50 in the first period of the year, and then they give you another $50 in the second period of the year, they're $100 and they're itemized on that second period, but they likely were not itemized on your first period. When you do have itemization, you are required to report the date received, the name of the contributor, their address, and their occupation and employer. Additionally, you're going to need to check the contributor code. So if it's an individual, committee, other, such as a business or a corporation, political party committee, or a small contributor committee. And that's all noted on the left-hand side. And we'll give you these slides at the end so you can go over it all together. So as you can see here, if you have those $100 or more contributions, they need to be itemized out on the schedule. However, for all the contributions that are less than $100, you aggregate them all together and put them as a lump sum on line 2 at the bottom of the summary page. So if 10 people contributed to you in varying amounts of less than $100, then you would add up their contributions and put them in that lump sum total at the bottom. So contributions given in an earlier period are added to the new contributions. That's that cumulative year-to-date column that's super helpful to you. So this is the main schedule you're going to use for money coming in. And now we're going to go over donor information that you'll need to report as mentioned. So that $100 threshold for itemization requires all of the following: the name and street address and the occupation and employer. So on the left-hand side, we have examples of complete information. And on the right-hand side, we have examples of incomplete information. So complete would be manager, Harvey's hardware store. If you just put manager, that would be incomplete because while we have the occupation, we do not have the employer. So as you can see, we have some examples here. There are some that would be complete that are just seem singular, such as retired and homemaker or student. But if someone is a consultant, you need to put the agency in which they're a consultant for. If they're an attorney, they need to put their law firm. And then if they're attorney self-employed, again, just say, as I hear, self-employed, no separate business name. So all this is very important to put. And as someone that worked in the enforcement division before coming to education, as it gets into election time, you may have opponents or people that want to review your campaign statements with a fine-tooth comb and file complaints on any issue. And this is something that was commonly filed as a complaint when I was in enforcement. So just like to caution everybody to make a good effort to obtain that donor and contributor information for all your contributions of $100 or more. So now we're going to go into loans. So Schedule B is for reporting loans. Basically, multiple loans by single sources are listed separately. You need to itemize out each individual loan. All loans received or outstanding are on Schedule B. Personal funds may be reported as a loan. So if a candidate, if you initially loan funds to your committee and you plan to be reimbursed by your committee at some point, those should be reported as a loan. And again, that needs to be routed through your campaign bank account. Remember that too. So each loan of $100 or more during that period, you need to disclose like the lender's name and address, report the bank that makes the loan or the guarantors of the loan. If a third party co-signs, endorses, or establishes a price line of credit for the loan. But basically, what we kind of want to take away here is that every loan is reported on here in separate lines, and personal funds can be used as a loan, but needs to be disclosed that way. So this is the schedule that goes over an example of how it would be reported. You will need to report all loans received until they are completely paid off. As you can see, there's a lot of different lines here that we'll go over. So as you can see, you need to put the full name, street address, if the individual and their occupation, employer, outstanding balance this period, amount received this period, and our two examples here, you can see they're a little different. Again, you need to fill out all the boxes, all the lines. So if it's zeros or NA, make sure to include that on there. And again, the cumulative year to date. Now, this is the only schedule where you may end up with a negative number, and that's okay. A candidate or committee may end up with a negative net change for this period if the loans that are paid or forgiven, as you can see in subdivision C here, paid or forgiven during the reporting period is larger than the loans received during the period. And again, that's okay. The importance here is that it's disclosed. So you need to make sure to report for each period where the loan's at, if you paid or forgiven it. And also, if you go to terminate your committee, these all need to be completely paid off or forgiven for you to terminate your committee. Now, loans can be a little complicated. So Stephen mentioned, if you have questions on stuff, always feel free to give us a call. But basically, the intention with the Form 460 and most things here is that we're a disclosure-based law and disclosing what your activity is. So now we're going to go on to non-monetary contributions. So Schedule C is what you use to report non-monetary contributions. And some examples of that on this slide include food and beverages, rental space, polls, and discounts. So you'll report the receipt of receiving these non-monetary, or sometimes the other term we use is in-kind contributions on this schedule. Similar to other schedules, the itemization is required at $100 or more. If it's received from a single contributor during the calendar year, same thing, the name, street address, city, state zip, the occupation and employer. Again, contributors that are of $100 or less of the in-kind contribution came in at $50, that's going to be itemized on the lump sum line 2. Just remember that that $100 itemization is going to count with both in-kind contributions for non-monetary and monetary. So if someone gave you a $75 campaign contribution and then donated $50 worth of beverages to your fundraiser, that's over $100, and that's going to require itemization. So that cumulative year-to-date column, that's your friend to be able to kind of signify to you, oh, we're over $100. I need to put them on here and itemize out their contributions, including both non-monetary and monetary on here. And again, for these, it's like the good or the value that we want you to report the fair market value of the goods or services. So basically what any member of the public would be able to obtain this non-monetary contribution at if it was given to you. So if someone donated flyers and they're like, oh, well, I paid $1,200 for that, but I'm giving them to you to distribute, you're going to report the $1,200 because that's the fair market value of the cost of the flyer for Luna Lovegood in this example to get for you. So going on to more information on non-monetary contributions. So as I kind of jumped the gun, so non-monetary contributions, you report those items at the fair market value. So the amount it would cost for a member of the public to purchase the item. You're going to need to describe the good or service, and you'll need to, again, aggregate monetary and non-monetary contributions. So goods and services for which you have not paid the fair market value, just to give some examples for people that are going to begin fundraising, include items like donated if you're going to do an auction or garage sale or artwork or furniture. Again, these are some things that you might get non-monetary items for, depending on what you want to do for fundraisers, if you wanted to do a raffle or things like that. So just be sure to keep good records, as Stephen mentioned in the beginning, with those things, especially and to make sure you're reporting everything as it is received. Again, these are a bit different. So when it comes to fundraising events, just be aware that if you accept non-monetary contributions, you might have dual reporting of receiving the initial item, and then if it's sold for more than the initial cost, to also report that as like a miscellaneous increase to cash. Okay, now we can go on to Schedule E. So now we're going into the money coming out schedules. So Schedule E is reporting campaign expenditures. So you're going to report these, and again, loans are only for B. So loans won't go on E at all. So all campaign expenditures must confer a political, legislative, or governmental purpose. We call this PLG. So campaign funds are held in trust. And so you need to make sure that all your expenditures are conferring one of those purposes. We hit the media pretty hard a couple of years ago when we find someone for furnishing their Hawaiian home as their second home and using campaign funds for that. So that's a no-no. So make sure that when you're making expenditures, they are meeting one of those elements of PLG. You can have petty cash on hand. It's $100 or less. So that is permissible. You're welcome to have that if you need cash for certain expenditures, but no cash expenditure of $100 or more. That is prohibited. Again, we want everything to be traceable. So we really advise against cash expenditures as much as you can, because you want to be able to trace it to report it on your campaign statements. Credit cards are okay. If you're going to use a personal credit card, it must be completely zeroed out first and can only be used for campaign purposes until campaign expenses are fully paid off. Now, something to note, a spouse or domestic partner of an elected official or candidate may not receive compensation from campaign funds for services rendered, including fundraising services for the candidate's campaign. I have received a phone call in the past asking if a candidate could pay their spouse for treasurer duties. And again, this is a no, you can't do that, because again, the campaign funds may not be used for personal purposes. So just be aware of that PLG provision and make sure that all campaign expenditures are conferring a non-personal benefit. So this is an example of how you would report payments on Schedule E. Same thing goes, where itemized contributions and expenditures of $100. Commonly, sometimes these are gifts, meals, and travel, which may require certain details. Payments of less than 100 still go on that lump sum line 2 on the summary page of Schedule E. So however, if 2 or more payments under $100 were made for a single product or service, and the total paid during the period is $100, itemize the total amount paid during the period. Reports payments made on accrued expenses, sometimes that will be required on Schedule F, but as you can see here, it requires that you either include a code for this one, for the second one for Hermione Granger, filing fees is the code, reimburse candidate for filing fees. So she didn't include a description of payment. It's one or the other. You can choose what works best for you, but one of these needs to be completed with each of your expenditures. So then we have a lunch as an example, and you have to include who attended the lunch, and then the amount paid. And then also in Schedule E, you can include information on sub-vendor payments. A sub-vendor is someone that you may contract with to help with your campaign. So commonly what we see are candidates may confirm with a consulting firm, and then you're going to report these sub-vendor payments from the consulting firm. So sub-vendors have campaign agents and consultants. The itemation starts at $500 or more. And we have a note here that you can reimburse campaign workers with 45 days. So you can either use Schedule E or Schedule G for reporting sub-vendor payments. This may not apply to all, but for some that are really wanting to campaign and reach out to having consulting firms or people work for them to do their campaign, you will need to report these payments. You cannot just report that you gave $5,000 to a consulting firm and not report where that money went. So as you can see here, we have an example of Harry Potter theme for Cho Chang Consulting, where they were paid $1,400. And then underneath that, it itemizes out vendors paid of $500 or more. So daily profit, $750 for literature, and Snape voter systems, $525 for voter information. So again, you need to itemize these out. Some of you may choose to put that on G, which is just strictly sub-vendor, but you are more than welcome to put it on Schedule E. But the main takeaway is you cannot just have a lump sum of what that sub-vendor payment is. You do need to itemize what they are doing with that money you are giving to your sub-vendor. Now, this is the summary page. This is probably the most helpful page, but the tedious to fill out one. So that's why we recommend that while this is at the beginning of your campaign statement, as you can see here, it is page 3. We recommend that you do it at the end. Once you've completed and reviewed all your other schedules, including the ones that we went over, Schedule A, Schedule B, C, E, and if you have sub-vendors, F or G for accrued expenses. So this is what you would be using. For local candidates, you're not going to need to bother with these very hard right-hand columns for state candidates. But as you can see, in the column A, it's total this period. And then column B is year to date. Now, all of this is really helpful, again, to know where you're at with your campaign. Again, for loans received, it's okay for it to be negative in net, as we went over earlier. Again, accrued expenses, that's unpaid bills, where that will be paid off at a future date. That's okay as well. The most important kind of takeaway is that your ending cash balance is what you're going to use on your next statement as your beginning cash balance, and make sure that that is consistent for each statement that you will be filing. But that's why we recommend that you do this at the end when you have all your numbers already calculated for your schedules, to then compute them into the summary page. But if you have electronic filing, the good news is that most of it will do the math for you. But this is what we recommend to you, to do this at the end. And again, we have a lot of information in our campaign manuals to also assist you if you have questions on filing this. Okay, now we're going to go over more details with campaigning, including the 497, filing schedules, advertisement disclosures, what examples of mass mailing, and what you need to do after the election. So with the 497, this is, or the 10-day report, this is a contribution report. Now, the 497 kind of sneaks up on us. So if you're a candidate on the June ballot, you're already in that 90-day election cycle and have a 24-hour reporting obligation through the date of the election on June 7th. Eventually, we're going to show you the filing schedule for the November election, and then you'll be able to see what your filing 90-day cycle will be for that. So as we go on with the 497, it's required when $1,000 or more is received from a single source within 90 days before or on the date of the election. It's filed by personal delivery, guaranteed overnight mail, fax, or email. So this is important to get filed as soon as possible with disclosure. As you can see, this is an example one where the one I want to note on this though, so the 24-hour report's also required for your own money. So if you give a contribution of $1,000 to your committee and it's your own personal funds, that's still going to require a 24-hour report. Contribution under the Political Reform Act includes candidates' own personal funds or candidate loans. So just note that as you go into your campaign, that even if you give your committee money, you're still going to be required to report it. And if it's over $1,000 in the 90-day cycle, you're going to need to file a 24-hour report on it. And each subsequent $1,000 post that as well, given to your committee. So this is a very important filing. Just stay on top of it. That's why record keeping is super important. To note that if someone gave you $500 and then on like March 9th, and then today they gave you $700, that's $1,200. You're going to need to file a 24-hour report 497 within 24 hours of receipt of that contribution. So also you'll need to file this too if you are giving contributions of $1,000 or more to other candidates or committees on the ballot in the 90-day frame. Okay, moving on. Filing schedules, super important, very helpful. So filing schedules, candidates and committees should be referred to filing schedules if you have questions on what form do I need to submit, what are the reporting periods, when is it due, and like, are there other notations or things I should be aware of? We have a disclaimer here because the filing schedules give a ton of information, but not all. So definitely use it as a reference guide, but we have other information on our website and feel free to call us, but I highly recommend to have it with you with your campaign literature and write on your calendar those due dates on when those Form 460s are due and when that 90-day election cycle starts so that you won't miss a deadline. So here we have the filing schedule for the November 8th, 2022 general election for local office. So as you can see here, the 24 90-day election cycle starts on August 10th if you're a candidate on the November 8th ballot. And we have some information here on the right-hand side of the notes of what we've been over today in our training, just to remind you about when those would be required to be filed. If you're a candidate on the ballot, you're required to file as a committee 2 pre-election campaign statements. The first one's going to be due in September. The second one's going to be due right before the election on October 27th. It's really important to remember these deadlines and due dates and make sure that they are filed timely. Again, public disclosure of these are very important. So just be sure to have these. The thing we want to highlight also the most here is that after the election, most candidates file the 460 semi-annually until the committee is terminated. So even if you lost, you still need to file until you terminate that committee. So this is we have them on our website, especially for these upcoming big elections for midterms that most people are going to be on the ballot for. But in the future, if there's a special election or a different election that's not a common one, definitely feel free to reach out to us or city clerk to have them ask for a filing schedule for us to create. So advertising disclosures. This is also very important. This is something too from my time in enforcement to be aware of. So if you're a committee, advertising disclosures are the portion of a political message that identifies the committee that paid for or authorized the communication. Some examples include most commonly paid for by committee name or ad paid for by committee name. Depending on the type of ad, it's going to change possibly what is required to be reported as the disclaimer. So be sure to check out our website. We have advertising disclaimer charts, which we will show on the next slide. Okay, so this is the disclosure chart for communications by candidates, committees for their own election. As you can see here, we have on this one all mass mailings and what would be required to be put on the mass mailing. And we have a slide that goes over this, but the one I want to highlight is one underneath it, all mass electronic mail, more than 200 substantially similar emails sent within a calendar month, paid for by name of candidate or committee. So if you're a Form 470 filer, you're still needing to put that you paid for this email communication on that if it's over 200 sent within a calendar month. So just be aware of this, especially as we kind of go into a modern digital age of these requirements, which is why we recommend that you have these advertisement disclaimer charts based on what advertisements you will be doing for your election. So this is an example of a identification on mass mailing. The definition of mass mailing is if more than 200 similar pieces of mail are sent within a calendar month. So sometimes that will be solicitation letters, fundraising notices, newsletters sent by the candidate or the committee, or other types of literature from the committee. One thing here, the Political Reform Act does not regulate the truth or accuracy of political communication, given that the First Amendment provides pretty broad protection of political speech. But for the most part, again, if you're a committee, you will be required to include that disclaimer on mass mailings of 200 similar pieces of mail sent in a month. So as you can see here, it says paid for by Hermione Granger for Minister of Magic. It would be 2022 this year. So that has the committee name, it has the committee's address, and it is in very close proximity to the address of the recipient of the mailing. And it's in no less than 6-point font and contrasting color to the mailing itself. So make sure to check all those boxes when you are sending out a mass mailing for your committee. Now, record keeping requirements. As mentioned, when I was in the enforcement division, sometimes we have a proactive program called Ad Watch. So someone might submit your mailing thinking that it might be a miss of the Act's requirements, and then you might get contacted by the FPPC asking for a copy. So that's why it's very important to keep good records of your mass mailings. And what we would say is retain a copy of each mass mailing you send and keep note of the date sent, the method of postage, number of pieces, and a copy of the mailing itself. So keep all those in your records with your committee on top of the contributor records, and that will help you if there's ever anything that goes amiss with anything or you're subject to an enforcement inquiry, you'll have everything good to go to be able to respond to that inquiry. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit to after the election. These are all geared for candidates that are Oakland City candidates in a sense that they have local campaign contribution limits. If you do not have local campaign contribution limits, you're an AB 571 candidate. That's a new law that went into effect in 2021. 2022 major election year, first time it's really coming to play. We have an AB 571 training next month that we're offering. And so please feel free to reach out to us if you're an AB 571 candidate. But if you are a non-AB 571 candidate and you were successful, You're going to continue to file reports and pay that $50 annual fee to Secretary of State while the committee remains open. You can continue to receive contributions to pay off campaign debt. You can use leftover funds for future election if they are redesignated or transferred. The important thing here is leftover funds become surplus funds 90 days after leaving office. So be aware of that deadline when the time comes that you're going to leave office on what you want to do with those leftover funds. So after the election, just be aware that you still carry a filing obligation. And that also goes for unsuccessful candidates who can vote. So if you were defeated, same thing, that you continue to file campaign statements and pay that annual fee until you terminate that committee. You can use leftover funds for future election if they are redesignated or transferred. Leftover funds become surplus if you're defeated 90 days after the end of the semi-annual reporting period following each election. So if you're a June candidate, that's 90 days following the end of July. And then if you're a November candidate, it is 90 days following the end of January. So that's where you'll want to think about what you want to do with that money, all those types of things. So just be aware of that surplus time period of 90 days. Now, let's say you want to run for office again after the election. Maybe you didn't win, or you are like, I've got to do this. You need to still file a 501. So a Form 501 is going to be required to be filed before you start soliciting contributions for that office. And then you'll amend your Form 410 by filing a new amended Form 410 that the committee name will be changed. So let's say 2022 doesn't work out. You want to run in 2026, you'll need to change the committee name to reflect that year. Now, if you're running for a different office, as mentioned, you'll need to file a 501 before you start soliciting contributions for that office. You'll need to file a new Form 410, which will name the new committee, will open a new committee bank account, and transfer funds to that new bank account. Note funds and assets must be transferred before that 90 days comes to a close, before they become surplus funds. All right, we made it. So now we are at the kind of resources section. So our website is a plethora of resources. The main one you're going to hang out on is the Learn tab and campaign rules. We also have information if you are a public official and employee rules section as well. But as you're a candidate running for office, campaign rules is probably going to be your friend, and that's where you'll find those filing schedules, campaign manuals, all those things. And as you can see here on the main page, you need a form on that right-hand side, view all forms, where you have them all in one spot. And so now we're going to go over the candidate toolkit and where to find that. So as mentioned, campaign rules, a great spot for you, but we have a candidate toolkit. So that was very helpful resources on what you need for getting started, where the reports are, communications, and what to do after the election. And if you're a treasurer attending this, we have basic rules for treasurers accessible on our website as well. And we thank you for attending. That is our contact information. So the 866 number is our phone advice number. We give advice 9 to 11:30 Monday through Thursday. However, when it's filing deadline time, like it is this week, we have extended hours, and we'll have extended hours in advance of the pre-election deadlines. But if you have a question that you missed the hours, definitely feel free to send it into our advice email. They are really good at responding pretty quickly, and most of them are responded to within 24 hours. So with that, we're done, and we'll start handling the questions.
Thank you, Chloe and Stephen. And so we'll go ahead and look at the question and answer box for those that submitted questions. And Suzanne, do we have any questions that came in during the presentation?
Yes, we do. So one of our first questions from an attendee is, how do they determine the monetary value of a donated item? So for those non-monetary contributions, how would they find out the fair market value that you mentioned?
A good place to probably start would be asking the donor on what they spent for it. And so someone donated a bottle of wine or purchased those flyers for you, to ask them, hey, how much did you spend on this? or look up online if they used a vendor, what that comprehensive would cost if they were to do it themselves. So that would be my suggestions, and to be able to report the fair market value. It's okay if you don't know to make a guess and write that it's an estimate, but you have to go back and amend and put the actual fair market value once you do know the fair market value of the contribution. We recommend to do that within 60 days.
Great. And Sean asks, where are the forms located? And before you answer that, I just want to make sure everybody knows that in Oakland, we have electronic campaign filing. So your campaign statements, you're going to be doing those all online. But otherwise, where do they find these forms that you've talked about?
They are on the FPPC's website. So our long title, so Fair Political Practices Commission, we shorten it to fppc.ca.gov. And as Stephen showed, it's on that main page, on that button on the third on the right, view all forms, and they're broken down by type. So all the campaign forms will be listed together for you.
Great. Brenda has a question, but maybe she wants to raise her hand. It looks like she's asking a question about the itemized contributions, but I think we need some clarification on what she's asking. Maybe we can move on while she's doing that. Lisa has a question about whether she needs to put the total to date for the election on Schedule A.
For Schedule A, per election to date, you'll need to, again, the most important would say it's per your reporting period for election to date. So to calculate that for your primary and your general, but to watch that cumulative column. So you will need to continue to just track everything. So it might be helpful, especially for candidates, if it's a runoff election, to put for the election so that they can make sure that they're not violating that campaign contribution limit per each election, because the June primary is considered its separate election than the November general.
And I'll mention our net file free software will do that for the treasurers. As you're recording your transactions in there, it does put the election to date total, it calculates that for you. Let's see. Next question was from Hannah. What if a campaign does not reimburse campaign workers within 45 days? Can I file an extension?
That's usually there's very few extensions that are ever offered under the Political Reform Act. So we don't have extensions for that. That's the rule for those type to be reimbursed. So it is just good to be mindful of it. That's number one, and to meet it, or then that passes. But very rare, there's even for the Form 700 deadline, there's very few extensions, if at all, offered. So there is not an opportunity to file for an extension with that.
Yeah, and if they miss the 45-day deadline, that expenditure becomes a non-monetary contribution. So they would need to record that as such. So if a campaign worker bought something and was not reimbursed within that 45 days, then it would become a non-monetary contribution.
And Lisa asks, if a candidate makes a loan during the 90-day period prior to the election, and I think she's suggesting that it would be of $1,000 or more, do we need to file a Form 497?
Yes. Loans are under the definition of contribution in the Political Reform Act, and you will need to file a 24-hour report 497 if you do loan your committee $1,000 or more during that election cycle.
And let's see, there was one more. I think Lisa's asking for some more clarification on the one bank account rule. Let's see. So when the campaign bank account reimburses the candidate, is this a violation of the one bank account rule? She's asking.
If you do it correctly from the beginning, if you loan your committee the money up front, then you are allowed to reimburse. But if you do it as a campaign contribution that you just wrote a check, it's just a contribution, then it would be improper to reimburse it. But with the loan, again, it's a loan to the committee made up front, have the record of it and make sure that the records reflect that in your campaign records. And then you can reimburse, as we've shown, Schedule B also for loans is money coming out. So you're going to be noting when you're paying down that loan. So you'll be showing continuous reporting on that as well. So it wouldn't be violating the one bank account rule if it follows that proper procedure of always being a loan. It starts to become a little difficult if you're combining campaign contributions and loans. So you just need to keep track of everything and good records of it.
Great. And it looks like we have one last question. So this has to do with how they use the funds after the election. If a candidate ends the campaign, what happens to the funds raised? Can the candidate transfer the funds to another campaign in that year?
So there, again, as we've talked about, campaign funds are held in trust. So it has to be a political, legislative, or governmental purpose with your campaign funds when you go to terminate your committee or do what you want to do. So as we mentioned, there's a couple of different options. So if a candidate stops the campaign, let's say they're just like, I'm done, I want to get rid of this, you can terminate the committee and you can either return those contributions to the contributor, donate to a 501c3 civic, charitable, religious organization, or donate to other candidates or committees to get a zero ending cash balance to terminate. However, if you want to transfer the funds into a different committee, you're going to want to do that before they become surplus funds. And that happens that 90 days after you're defeated or when you leave office. So after that 90 days of defeated in that post-election period. So if that's going to happen, that's going to be like, you want to think about it with the 3 months after that post-election semi-annual. So after that, that's when you're going to want to possibly open up a new committee and open a new bank account and put those money into that account. Or if it's going to be the same office that you're seeking, then you can just kind of roll it over with a 410 amendment. We have those slides on that. So I'd recommend to go back and look at the slides depending on what route you want to take. There are definitely a lot of different courses you can take if you stop your campaign, what you can do with those campaign funds. But you can transfer them to another committee in the same year, but it needs to be within those 90 days after that post-election semi-annual.
Great. Well, that's it, unless anybody else wants to type in a question or raise their hand.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you again, Chloe and Stephen, for that presentation. Very helpful. And so at this time, we're going to go ahead and shift gears to the local requirements here in the city of Oakland. And so this will be a little bit briefer in terms of length, but nonetheless, very important information that we want to make sure that everybody has. And so as I go ahead and share my screen here, we'll go ahead and jump right in. And so it's important to know that the rules that we have here in the city of Oakland do coincide in terms of the state rules that we just heard in terms of with the FPPC and the Political Reform Act. And so as we jump in, it's really important to know that even as we have rules at the state level, in addition, we do have local political campaign rules for candidates and campaign committees here in the city of Oakland. And so just want to share a little bit of background information about the Public Ethics Commission. We are pretty much the local equivalent of the FPPC here in the city of Oakland, really here to ensure fairness, openness, integrity, and honesty here in local government. And so we are tasked with jurisdiction over the Oakland Campaign Reform Act, which we'll talk about today. As well as we want to let you know as far as our office being available for advice and assistance with any questions that you may have related to local rules here in the city of Oakland, as well as navigating some of these requirements that we'll talk about today. We always like to share that this overview isn't meant to be any type of legal advice. So if you do have any fact-specific questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to our office, to our advice and assistance line, and we'd be happy to assist you with any of the questions that you have. So what we'll cover today, briefly, we'll go over the Oakland Campaign Reform Act. We'll also talk about, as Suzanne shared a little bit earlier, about our electronic filing requirement. We'll also share about the voluntary campaign spending limits that we have here in the city of Oakland and what you'll need to do to either accept or reject those spending limits. We'll also go over our local contribution limits as well as restrictions. And we'll also briefly touch on the limited public financing program, which is specific to district city council candidates here in the city of Oakland, as well as providing some additional resources that are available. So just briefly in understanding the Oakland Campaign Reform Act, once again, it does provide local rules that are in addition to the state rules of the Political Reform Act. It's important to understand for candidates and committees and treasurers, as you're here on this presentation, that you must comply with both. So our rules are not to conflict with the Political Reform Act and vice versa, and candidates and their committees must comply with both. And we'll briefly talk about some things that OCRA establishes. One is that, as I shared before, it establishes electronic filing requirements. It also establishes local contribution limits, as well as optional expenditure limits for campaigns here in the city of Oakland. And we also have a contractor contribution restriction that is in place for entities or individuals that are doing business either with the city of Oakland or with the Oakland Unified School District. So first we'll talk about the electronic filing requirement. And so it's important to know that all campaigns, their committees are required, it is mandatory for electronic filing of their candidate campaign statements or campaign statements in general for any committees that are open. Before you'll get access to our electronic filing portal, you will need to file a Form 300, which you see here on the screen. This form does provide an application for your online login and password for both the candidate and the treasurer to make sure that we have a signature on file as we create the online account. And so we do provide a free electronic filing service through NetFile here in the city of Oakland. And so once you file that Form 300, we recommend that it should be filed when you turn in or submit your initial Form 410 as you're creating your campaign committee. And so once we receive that information and that filing, we'll go ahead and get you set up with your NetFile account. There is a free 30-minute phone training that NetFile does provide for all campaign committees to understand in terms of the function of NetFile and getting familiar with that interface and the software. And we always want to encourage committees, don't wait until filing day. You really want to start early with understanding the NetFile system and always call for any assistance that you may need early on to move through any hiccups that you may face or move through any questions that you may have. So once again, really understanding that there is a electronic filing requirement. So you will not be filing paper copies with our office. The only initial filing that you will do in paper will be the Form 501, which your initial filing will be with the city clerk. And then you'll also submit us a copy of that form. And then we'll go ahead and we'll be getting you set up when you submit that Form 410, which is another form that you will be doing, I believe, in paper initially, but all of your Form 60 statements, all of your campaign disclosures will be done electronically. And you will first need to file Form 300 before doing so that we have the proper signatures on file. Suzanne, was there anything additional that we wanted to add in regards to filing Form 300?
No, I think you did. That's a great explanation, Jelani. But just to share for the volunteer treasurers and any candidates here who may be acting as their own treasurers, I just want to emphasize, like Jelani did, that this isn't as simple as, filling in a form, like a PDF form online. So there is a bit of a learning curve. So that's why we're really emphasizing that you take advantage of that training and learn the system so that you're not caught and having problems as the deadline's approaching.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. And yes, we definitely want to make sure that you all have the resources that are available to comply with the rules that we are going over today, and then letting you know that we do have resources available to help you navigate and also help you with your responsibilities under OKRA here in the city of Oakland. So next we'll talk about the voluntary campaign spending limits here in the city of Oakland. And so there are really two paths that a committee can take, a candidate committee can take when it comes to campaign fundraising here in the city of Oakland. And so a candidate can choose one of two roads to take. One is accepting the voluntary spending limits here in the city of Oakland. And so the expenditure ceilings, they are connected by district and are allotted for every race here in the city of Oakland. And as you can see on the right hand of the screen, the breakdown in terms of what those ceilings are equate to here in the city of Oakland. And those ceilings are adjusted every year by the Consumer Price Index. And then as a note for this upcoming election that we have this year, most of you know that the decennial census was just taken, and the Oakland Redistricting Commission just recently adopted the final map, which lays out the district boundaries here in the city of Oakland. And so we recently published the updated numbers for this year, but we'll be doing a modification to come out soon as the Redistricting Commission just updated the district maps. So what you see here on the screen will be updated slightly with the new numbers. But as we talk about these voluntary expenditure ceilings, these are what we are referring to as you look at the specific districts or your specific race here in the city of Oakland. And so by voluntarily accepting the spending limits here in the city of Oakland, what it allows a candidate committee to do is to raise contributions at a higher amount. And so the candidate and their committee can spend up to the spending limit for that election. And so as you look at the table here on this slide, if a individual was running for a District 1 council member seat, that the expenditure ceiling would be $175,000. And so by accepting to limit your expenditures to that $175,000, it would allow you to raise contributions at a higher amount, and which we'll talk about briefly on the next slide. And so the second path is that a candidate and their committee can choose to reject or not accept the spending limits for their race. And so essentially they would not be bound by the spending limit that you see identified in the table here on the screen, but they would not be allowed to raise contributions at the higher amount. And we'll talk about what those contribution limits are on the next slide. And so in a nutshell, the benefit of agreeing to limit your spending by this voluntary spending limit is the ability to receive contributions in a greater amount than those who don't. And so in order to accept the spending limits here in the city of Oakland, you will have to file OKRA Form 301 with the Public Ethics Commission. And it is important to note that you must file OKRA Form 301 before receiving contributions at the higher limit. And so this is a form that can be filed electronically or filed and filled out on our website and filed with our office. And once again, intent is not good enough for just accepting at the higher amount. You must file Form 301 with our office. We must receive it before you can receive contributions at the higher limit. And so as we talked about the spending limits and filing a Form 301 to receive contributions at the higher limit, there are local contribution limits and restrictions that we'll go over here on this slide. And so candidates that do agree to limit their spending by filing Form 301 and accepting that voluntary spending ceiling, they are allowed to raise contributions from persons at $900 per election, and then by broad-based political committees as defined by the Oakland Campaign Reform Act at $1,800 per election. And so the difference here, as we talk about being able to raise contributions at the higher amount versus those who do not agree to limit their spending, and the contribution limits for those that choose not to abide by the spending limits. For persons, it would be $200 per election, and then for broad-based political committees at $400 per election. So you can see the significance in terms of the difference of the contribution limits for those that agree to limit their spending versus those who don't. And so regardless of whether a candidate accepts or rejects the voluntary expenditure ceilings or spending limits, any candidate is free to contribute to or loan his or her campaign any amount of money from their own personal funds. And so in a nutshell, personal loans or contributions that are made to your campaign are not subject to these contribution limits. But we do want to share that if you are intending to participate in the city's limited public financing program, that there are rules that are in place that would limit your personal contributions, which we'll talk about on a later slide. But in general, those limits would not pertain to your own personal contributions or loans. We do have one additional note that we want to highlight on this slide is that candidates cannot directly or indirectly solicit contributions from city employees or board and commission members unless part of a mass solicitation to the general public. And this is a part of our Government Ethics Act here in the city of Oakland that does apply this rule of directly or indirectly soliciting contributions from other city employees or what are deemed as public servants here in the city of Oakland. And the only exception to that is if it was a part of a mass solicitation that was to the general public that just happens to include a public servant. But you will want to make sure that if you're sending out direct emails, that you're taking out any City of Oakland emails out of that distribution list to ensure that you're not directly soliciting from city employees or public servants as deemed by the Government Ethics Act here in the city of Oakland. And so as we talk about the contribution limits here in the city of Oakland, it's important that we define what a person is, because generally, as we see, there are two categories for the contribution limits when it comes to persons or broad-based political committees. And so it's important to know that person is defined broadly. And so it doesn't just include individuals, but it also includes businesses, organizations, and any committee that does not qualify as a broad-based political committee. So many may assume that a political action committee or a PAC is automatically going to be a broad-based political committee, and thus you can receive contributions from them at that higher amount of $1,800. But we do want to share that that is not always so, and you'll always want to make sure that when you're receiving contributions from a committee, that they do meet the definition of broad-based political committee before receiving at that higher contribution amount. And so we'll cover what constitutes a broad-based political committee here on this slide. And so the Oakland Campaign Reform Act does define a broad-based political committee as a committee that has been in existence for more than 6 months. It must also receive contributions from 100 or more persons, in addition to making contributions to 5 or more candidates. And so it is not a requirement that all 5 or more candidates be running for office in the city of Oakland, but nonetheless, it must make contributions to 5 or more candidates. And so in order for a committee to be deemed a broad-based political committee here in the city of Oakland and be able to contribute at that $1,800 amount or up to that $1,800 amount, they must meet these 3 requirements per the Oakland Campaign Reform Act. As a tip, candidates should always assume the limit for contributions from persons applies unless they know that the committee qualifies as a broad-based political committee or broad-based committee. So to help determine whether a political committee qualifies as a broad-based political committee, candidates can search the filings of state registered political committees utilizing the California Secretary of State's website at www.sos.ca.gov. And so once again, the big takeaway from this slide is that you'll really want to make sure that you verify and confirm that a committee meets this definition of a broad-based political committee before accepting contributions of up to that $1,800 limit. So in this next slide, we talk about the rules around aggregation of contributions. And so the Oakland Campaign Reform Act really defines in terms of when a committee receives contributions from two or more entities when they're treated as coming from the same person. And so for the sake of this rule, contributions from two or more entities are treated the same or is coming from the same person when the entities share a majority of members on their respective board of directors. The entities share three or more or a majority of officers. The entities are owned or controlled by the same majority shareholders, or the entities are in a parent subsidiary relationship. And then lastly, if one entity finances, maintains, or controls the other entity's contributions or expenditures. And so a couple of things that you'll want to watch out for in terms of these aggregation rules is you'll want to look out for any contributions that come from the same name being printed on two separate checks, or the same person signing multiple checks. And so it's important to note that contributions by two individuals married to each other, they are treated as separate contributions and wouldn't be considered aggregated for the sake of this rule. But when it comes to businesses, you'll want to make sure that, if it's a CEO of a company or they're a majority member of an organization, they cannot give individually and also from that business account or a contribution in that business name. For the sake of our aggregation rules, they would be treated as one and the same, and could potentially violate the contribution limits here in the city of Oakland. So you'll really want to make sure treasurers that you're verifying and really looking closely at contributions that come from businesses and organizations and other entities to make sure that they're not being aggregated or exceeding the contribution limit here in the city of Oakland. So this next slide talks about when loans and unpaid bills can become contributions under the rules here in the city of Oakland. So it is not unusual for folks to either take out loans or to spend more money that they have taken in as it relates to election or be billed for future expenses. And so it's important to know when you are in those circumstances that loans or any extensions of credit or unpaid bills can become a contribution subject to limits if they are more than $1,500 and 90 days out. And so we really want to make sure and stress to you all that if you're not able to pay any outstanding bills within 90 days, that you should arrange for some type of payment schedule in which all vendors are paid something on a regular basis. Because if you receive some type of bill or some type of extension of credit that is not paid within that 90 days, and it is more than $1,500, under OKRA, it will become a contribution. And if it is from an individual, then it will exceed the contribution limit and can become a violation under OKRA. So you'll want to make sure that if you have that extension of credit or you have a bill that has not been paid within that 90-day period, that you do have some type of payment schedule that is arranged to show that you are making payments towards that bill, towards that unpaid extension of credit, so that it doesn't become a violation of the contribution limits here in the city of Oakland. And then once again, as it was shared in the prior presentation with the FPPC, you'll want to make sure that you're disclosing that on your campaign statements because that is a requirement under the Oakland Campaign Reform Act as well. So we'll briefly talk about some of the notice requirements here in the city of Oakland. This one is specific to campaign fundraising materials. And so all campaign fundraising material here in the city of Oakland must consist of the following language. And so the Oakland Campaign Reform Act limits campaign contributions by all persons. So alluding to the contribution limits that we discussed in the previous slides, but also alerts them to the prohibition that we have on those who are contracting with the city as well. And so it prohibits contributions during specific periods from contractors doing business with the city of Oakland or the Oakland Unified School District. It's important to know that this notice should appear on any printed or electronic medium that solicits or explains how to make a campaign contribution. So this is not just limited to remit envelopes or things that you use to collect money, say at a fundraiser, but this must appear on any printed or electronic medium that you're soliciting or sharing or explaining how to make a contribution to your campaign is required to have this noticing requirement. So in addition to some of the other prohibitions that we talked about, we'll talk about the contractor prohibition here in the city of Oakland. And so persons that are negotiating contracts with the city of Oakland or the Oakland School Board may not make contributions to Oakland candidates. And so this is a specific time frame that this contractor ban applies. And it is from the time that negotiations are in effect and then they begin, well, negotiations of that contract begin to 180 days after the completion or termination of the negotiations of the contract. And so this applies, so when we're talking about the commencement of negotiations, this really deals with any time that there's a submission for a bid or proposal or any type of contract amendment that is submitted to any elected or appointed body here in the city of Oakland. And then once again, through 180 days after the completion or the termination of the negotiations of that contract. And so the contract ban applies to contracts that would require either city council or school board approval. And in the event that the individual or the person that are negotiating a contract is an entity, this would also apply to the president of the board or a CEO, someone in that position, or somebody that owns 20% or more interest in that entity, as well as somebody that is designated or authorized to negotiate on behalf of that organization with the city would also be included in that contractor ban. And so as a tip, we do have a contributor verification card to find out from contributors when they are negotiating a contract with the city or school board. And we really want to emphasize that the onus is on the campaign committee to verify if folks are prohibited from contributing to their campaign. And so the verification card will help in identifying at the point of the individual or the business or the committee making a contribution to your campaign that they would have to self-identify or be able to attest that they are not prohibited either by the contractor prohibition or, as we talked about as well, that they are not prohibited due to the aggregation rules here in the city of Oakland. And so we really encourage that you would implement in your campaign fundraising materials some type of verification that the contributor would acknowledge that they are not prohibited either by the contractor prohibition or by our aggregation rules from contributing to your campaign. So it's important to know that there are definitely fees and up to some significant fines that can be levied for violations of the Oakland Campaign Reform Act. And so in general, we really want to stress that filing deadlines are very important. As it was alluded to by the representatives from the FPPC, folks, campaigns are highly scrutinized, especially, in election season where folks are paying attention to campaign disclosures. And it is something, once again, that is required and it is a benefit to the public in terms of understanding how money is flowing in and out of campaigns and how they impact elections. And so we do want to share that non-filers in the case here in the city of Oakland are posted online. So you'll want to make sure that you are meeting the filing deadlines. and that your campaign committee is responsive to the correspondence that we send out during the election to make sure that you are meeting those deadlines, because they will be posted online. We definitely want to let you know that late filer fees will be enforced. And so you'll want to make sure that you're meeting those deadlines, because there are fees that can be assessed for late campaign statements here in the city of Oakland. And also any non-filers that are beyond 45 days late here in the city of Oakland, they will be referred to the FPPC Enforcement Division as well. So once again, we are really wanting to stress that you want to make sure that you're meeting the filing deadlines and getting those campaign statements turned in on time. We have had several recent enforcement actions here in the city of Oakland that have come before our Public Ethics Commission. One recently that dealt and levied both late fees and fines for campaign statements that weren't filed here in the city of Oakland. And those can range anywhere from hundreds to thousands of dollars. So once again, we want to really stress that not only from an enforcement standpoint, but one from a transparency standpoint, to make sure that you're getting those statements in on time. We've also had recently, or have an open case in dealing with a campaign committee that received public financing through our LPF program, but then failed to file all of their campaign statements here in the city of Oakland, and an enforcement action is being taken against them as well. And so we really want to, once again, let all campaign committees know that you are required to meet these deadlines. And then there are enforcement penalties that are assessed when those filing deadlines are not met, or when filing schedules, after we reach out and continue to try to get those filings turned in, if we are not getting cooperation, that they will be referred to the FPPC, that can also assess other fines in addition as well. So lastly, we'll briefly touch on the limited public financing program here in the city of Oakland. And once again, this is specific to candidates that are running for district city council races here in the city of Oakland. We do make public funding available for those candidates, ranging anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 by way of reimbursement for specific and qualified campaign expenditures here in the city of Oakland. There are program requirements in order to be eligible for public financing here in the city of Oakland. One being that a candidate cannot loan or give personal funds of more than 10% of the expenditure ceiling here in the city of Oakland. So as we shared before, although there are not contribution limits that apply to personal funds here in the city of Oakland, if a candidate wants to participate for public financing, then they would need to limit their personal funds or loans to 10% of the expenditure ceiling here in the city of Oakland. In addition, a candidate must raise contributions and make expenditures that are equal to 5% of the expenditure ceiling in order to be eligible for public financing. And they must submit required forms, copies of invoices, checks, and mailers when submitting for reimbursements and to qualify for public financing here in the city of Oakland. And they also must attend a training that will take place in August once certification from the city clerk's office takes place for those that will be on the ballot. And so if you are interested, if you are a city council candidate, we do have a guide that goes through all of the rules and program requirements for those that will be participating in the public financing program, that is available on our website. And there will be additional communications that will go out as we get closer to the candidate ballot certification here in the city of Oakland. But we do want to share these requirements early, so that if you are thinking about participating and receiving public funds, knowing that you must meet these requirements, and specifically if you're doing any self-financing for your campaign, that you must limit it to less than 10% of the expenditure ceiling for your race. So lastly, we'll just talk about the resources that are available. We do provide a binder that does include not only the FPPC campaign manual that was alluded to earlier, but we do also include our Oakland Campaign Reform Act guide that goes over all of the rules we discussed today, and does provide additional summaries for additional rules that apply to campaigns here in Oakland, as well as our limited public financing guide for those district city council candidates that will be applying for public funds. And then lastly, we do have our advice and assistance line for campaigns and their committees. If they want to reach out to our office, either via phone or by email, we also do send out advisories throughout the campaign season and cycle regarding specific topics that are relevant. So you'll want to make sure that we do have an accurate email on file for our distribution list, and making sure that you check that email frequently, as we'll be sending out communications to make sure that you're aware of various deadlines and communications that we send out. And then lastly, we do have additional resources on our PEC website that is available to all campaigns and their committees when it comes to compliance with the rules here in the city of Oakland, and then additional resources that you may need when it comes to electronic filing, as well as advisories that we do have and make available to those that may need them. And so with that, that will bring me to the conclusion of the Oakland specific portion, but we do want to take time to answer any questions that you may have, as well as be able to go over anything in case there was additional clarity that you may have needed on any of the information that we covered here today. And so I'll turn to Suzanne at this time to see if there were any questions that came in the queue as we were discussing these slides, or if there's any that are popping up that we can further discuss as it relates to Oakland specific requirements per the Oakland Campaign Reform Act.
Thanks, Jelani. Yeah, Chelsea has a great question. She says, if a candidate's running in another jurisdiction, but also has a committee open in the city of Oakland, do you want the other committee to file electronically too and file a Form 300, or do you want a paper filing? And I guess I could answer that one. So the rule, Chelsea, is that if the committee is required to file a campaign statement or report with the city of Oakland as the local filing officer, then it needs to be filed electronically. So in a case where a candidate controls multiple committees, and then they're required to file, for example, Chloe or Stephen can correct me, but I believe the rule is that if a candidate has a controlled committee and they're running for office, then they have to file campaign statements for their other controlled committees at the same time for those pre-election deadlines. So in a situation like that, yes, they would need to file electronically those statements. And so then we would need the Form 300 verifying who the treasurer is, so that we can give them access to an electronic filing account.
To add on to that, Suzanne's correct. We call it cross-filing. So if you are a candidate on the ballot in Oakland, but let's say you're a county office holder, County Board of Supervisors in Alameda, you're going to have to cross-file in both jurisdictions in which you're a candidate, in which you're an office holder for those statements. And that's for committees that you have open. If you're a Form 470 filer, not applicable, but for committees, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some other examples of that is sometimes we'll have office holders. They might have what we call an office holder account with campaign funds and office holder funds that they maintain while for office holder expenses. And then they might have a re-election campaign as a separate committee. You could have a legal defense committee as another type of committee. And we also have sometimes ballot measure committees that are controlled by candidates. So there are some office holders that might have 2 or 3 committees active at one time, and they have to disclose those all together. So right now we have no other questions, but I guess people are also free to raise their hands if they have any wrap-up questions they want to ask before we end.
Right.
Looks
Well, if
good.
there's no additional questions, we once again want to thank everyone for taking the time this afternoon To complete this candidate and treasurer training, I want to thank our friends once again from the FPPC. Thank you, Chloe and Stephen, for making yourselves available, providing this important information. So once again, these slide decks will be made available via email to all the participants. So you will receive the slide deck with all the resources that were mentioned. And this recording will be available on the PEC's website. We do also want to once again highlight and lift up that we do have a quiz for candidate or committee treasurers that will be made available after this training. And so in taking and completing that training or that quiz for all of the treasurers, you will be listed upon completion and passing of the quiz on the PEC's website, just as something to promote treasurers here in the city of Oakland that understand the rules and are complying with the rules here in the city of Oakland. So once again, we have the resources that are available to all of you. And please feel free, if you have additional or follow-up questions that you may not have thought of during this training, please reach out to us via email or by phone. We'd be happy to assist you, and we'll be here throughout the duration of the campaign season to assist you, to help you, and to guide you along the way in complying with both state and local rules that apply to campaigns and their committees. So thank you once again. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's training and presentation. Hope you all have a great afternoon and look forward to working with you all this campaign season.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe and Stephen.